The crosshairs never wavered. 847 meters away, through the chaos of screaming crowds and billowing smoke, Elena Vasquez held her breath and made the most impossible shot in Secret Service history. The bullet traveled for 2-3 seconds before finding its target, stopping an assassin's finger just millimeters from triggering a weapon that would have changed the course of American history forever. What nobody knew in that moment was that Elena Vasquez wasn't supposed to be there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She wasn't supposed to have a rifle, and according to every official record, she wasn't even qualified to hold one. 3 years earlier, she had been kicked out of sniper training for a single failed shot. Today, that failure would save a president's life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking garage beneath the Riverside Convention Center in Phoenix, Arizona, as Elena Vasquez made her rounds with the methodical precision of someone who took security seriously. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a person who had learned to measure success in small victories rather than grand achievements. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform bore the simple patch of Blackwater Security Solutions, a private firm contracted to handle perimeter security for the convention center's endless stream of corporate events and political gatherings. Elena's steel-toed boots echoed against the concrete as she checked each level of the garage, her trained eyes scanning for anything out of place. Other security guards called her obsessive, the way she memorized every vehicle, noted every new face, and insisted on walking the entire perimeter twice each shift. What they didn't understand was that Elena Vasquez saw threats everywhere, because she had been trained to eliminate them with surgical precision from distances that most people couldn't even see clearly. Tommy Rodriguez, the maintenance supervisor, waved from across the garage where he was servicing the ventilation system. At 53, Tommy had worked at the convention center for over a decade and had seen dozens of security guards come and go. Most treated their job as a temporary stepping stone, but Elena was different. She understood the building systems better than some of the engineers, could spot structural vulnerabilities that others missed, and had an uncanny ability to predict where problems might arise before they manifested. "Morning, Elena," Tommy called out, wiping grease from his hands with a well-worn rag. "You're here early again. Don't you ever sleep?" Elena smiled, the expression softening features that had been hardened by experiences she rarely discussed. "Sleep is overrated, Tommy. Besides, someone needs to make sure this place is ready for the circus coming to town." The circus she referred to was the arrival of President Katherine Morrison, scheduled to address the Western Economic Summit in 3 days. The convention center buzzed with preparation as advance teams from the Secret Service, FBI, and local law enforcement agencies transformed the normally quiet venue into a fortress of security protocols and surveillance systems. Elena had been working closely with the advance teams, her detailed knowledge of the building's layout proving invaluable to agents trying to identify potential security risks. Agent Marcus Webb, a seasoned Secret Service operative with 15 years of presidential protection experience, had been particularly impressed with Elena's thoroughness. Unlike many private security contractors who viewed federal agents as an inconvenience, Elena anticipated their needs and provided comprehensive briefings on everything from emergency exit routes to the optimal positioning of counter-sniper teams on surrounding rooftops. "Vasquez," Webb had told her the previous evening, "you think like an agent. Ever consider federal service?" The question had struck Elena like a physical blow, dredging up memories she had spent 3 years trying to bury. She had deflected with humor, making a joke about the government's tendency to drown everything in paperwork, but Webb's words lingered long after he left for his hotel. Elena's shift officially began at 6 in the morning, but she had been arriving at 4:30 for the past week, using the extra time to familiarize herself with the expanded security perimeter and the constantly evolving threat assessment reports. The convention center sat in the heart of downtown Phoenix, surrounded by office buildings, hotels, and residential complexes that created countless angles of approach for anyone with hostile intentions. Each building represented a potential sniper's nest, each window a possible threat vector. As she walked the perimeter, Elena's mind automatically calculated distances, wind patterns, and sight lines with the reflexive precision of someone who had spent years studying the geometry of precision shooting. The Bank of Arizona building to the north stood 430 meters away, its rooftop offering a clear view of the convention center's main entrance. The Marriott Hotel to the east was closer, but partially obscured by construction scaffolding that would complicate any shot. The residential tower to the south presented the most challenging angle, but also the most concealment for someone willing to take the risk. Elena's handheld radio crackled to life as the morning security briefing began. Director Patricia Hawkins, the no-nonsense head of the Secret Service's Phoenix field office, ran through the day's preparations with military efficiency. Each agency reported their status, from the Phoenix Police Department's traffic control measures to the FBI's background checks on convention center staff. When Elena's turn came to report on building security, her assessment was characteristically thorough. Perimeter secure, all access points monitored, parking garage cleared and sealed. Maintenance reports no unusual activity in utility tunnels or mechanical spaces. Building systems all green across the board. What Elena didn't mention was the anomaly she had noticed in the delivery schedule. A catering truck from Southwest Premium Foods was listed for a delivery at 2:15 in the afternoon. But Elena's careful cross-referencing with the convention center's catering contracts showed no record of Southwest Premium Foods being authorized for the event. She had already flagged the discrepancy for investigation, but something about the timing bothered her in ways she couldn't articulate. Captain Lisa Park from the Phoenix Metro SWAT Division had positioned her teams on 3 surrounding buildings, their presence a visible deterrent to anyone contemplating hostile action. Elena had walked through the sniper positions with Park's team leaders, offering insights about wind patterns and structural vibrations that could affect long-range accuracy. The SWAT snipers were competent professionals, but Elena noticed things. They missed subtle factors that could mean the difference between a successful shot and a catastrophic failure. During her lunch break, Elena retreated to her small office in the security wing, a cramped space she had transformed into a command center with detailed maps, threat assessments, and communication equipment that went far beyond what Blackwater Security typically provided their contractors. The walls were covered with photographs of the convention center from every conceivable angle, marked with notes about sight lines, vulnerabilities, and defensive positions. To a casual observer, it might have looked like the workspace of someone preparing for an attack rather than preventing one. Elena opened her laptop and reviewed the latest intelligence briefings, her eyes scanning for patterns that others might miss. 3 separate intelligence agencies had identified credible threats against President Morrison, ranging from disgruntled political extremists to foreign agents seeking to destabilize American economic policy. The threat level was high enough to warrant additional security measures, but not so specific as to allow for targeted countermeasures. Agent Webb knocked on her office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the tired expression of someone who had been working 18-hour days for the past week. Elena gestured for him to sit in the only chair that wasn't covered with security reports and building schematics. "You know, Vasquez," Webb said, settling into the chair with a grateful sigh, "I've worked with a lot of private security contractors over the years, and most of them think their job ends at checking IDs and watching monitors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." You approach this like someone who's been doing presidential protection for decades. Elena accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, using the pause to consider her response. Webb was fishing for information, trying to understand why a building security coordinator seemed to possess knowledge and instincts that typically required years of specialized training. She had deflected similar questions from other agents, but something about Webb's direct approach made evasion feel dishonest. "I pay attention to details," Elena said carefully. "In security work, the details are what keep people alive." Webb studied her with the analytical gaze of someone trained to read people's motivations and deceptions. "Details are important, but what you're doing goes beyond attention to detail. You think tactically. You anticipate threats that haven't materialized. Yet, that kind of awareness usually comes from experience under fire." The observation hit closer to the truth than Elena was comfortable with, bringing back memories of Afghan mountainsides and Taliban fighters who had learned to exploit even the smallest tactical mistakes. She had served 2 tours as a Marine, Corps' designated marksman before applying for sniper training, accumulating commendations for precision shooting under combat conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. But all of that experience counted for nothing after a single failed qualification shot had ended her military career and shattered her confidence in ways that 3 years of civilian life hadn't fully repaired. Experience comes in many forms. Elena replied diplomatically, hoping to end the conversation before it ventured into territory she wasn't prepared to explore. Webb seemed to sense her discomfort and shifted the conversation back to operational matters. "The latest intelligence suggests our biggest threat comes from elevated positions. Phoenix PD has additional sniper teams on standby, but I'm concerned about coverage gaps. Someone with the right skills and equipment could potentially find an angle we haven't secured." Elena's pulse quickened as she considered the implications. Her mental map of downtown Phoenix included dozens of potential sniper positions that would be impossible to fully secure, without lockdown measures that would effectively shut down half the city. The key was identifying which positions offered the combination of concealment, escape routes, and clear sight lines that a professional assassin would require. "The residential tower on South Central Avenue," Elena said without hesitation. 23rd floor, southeast corner apartment. It's currently vacant due to renovation work, which means no civilian presence to complicate things. The angle gives a clear view of the convention center's main entrance, and there's roof access for helicopter extraction if needed. Webb pulled out his tablet and cross-referenced Elena's assessment with the Secret Service's own threat evaluation. The apartment she had identified was indeed flagged as a potential concern, but it had been assigned a lower priority due to the challenging angle and the assumption that renovation work would make it unsuitable for precision shooting. "You're right," Webb said, his voice carrying the note of respect. "I'll make sure we get additional coverage on that position." "How did you spot that so quickly?" Elena stood and walked to the window, her eyes automatically tracking the sight lines. She had memorized weeks earlier, geometry and human nature. Most people think longer distance means greater difficulty, but sometimes the hardest shot is the one that looks easy to everyone else. A professional would choose the position that offers the best combination of concealment and escape options, even if it means a more challenging angle. The afternoon brought increased activity as the final security preparations accelerated toward the president's arrival. Elena coordinated with arriving federal agents, local law enforcement officers, and private security teams from a dozen different agencies, her calm competence earning grudging respect from professionals who typically dismissed civilian contractors as necessary inconveniences. She moved through the building with the confident stride of someone who knew every corner, every vulnerability, and every advantage the structure offered to both protectors and potential threats. As the sun began to set over Phoenix, casting long shadows across the convention center's plaza, Elena completed her final security sweep of the day. Tomorrow would bring the president's advance team for a comprehensive security review. The day after that, President Catherine Morrison would arrive for what was supposed to be a routine address to the Western Economic Summit. Elena had done everything in her power to ensure that routine remained undisturbed, but a growing sense of unease suggested that the next few days would test every skill she had acquired in a lifetime of training for moments that mattered. Standing alone in the security office as the night shift took over, Elena opened a small locked drawer in her desk and retrieved a single item that she kept hidden from her colleagues: a faded photograph of herself in Marine Corps dress blues, wearing the expert marksmanship badge that represented thousands of hours of training and dozens of confirmed kills in service to her country. The woman in the photograph looked confident, purposeful, and completely unaware that a single failed shot would soon strip away everything she had worked to achieve. Elena locked the photograph away and headed home to her small apartment, where she would spend the evening cleaning and maintaining a precision rifle that she officially had no reason to own and no authority to use. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Elena Vasquez was determined to be ready for whatever threats emerged from the shadows of downtown Phoenix. The second day of preparations brought an unwelcome surprise in the form of Commander Ryan Burke, a broad-shouldered man whose presence seemed to drain the energy from every room he entered. Burke arrived at the Riverside Convention Center with a team of tactical specialists from a private military contractor called Apex Solutions, their black SUVs and tactical gear creating an immediate atmosphere of tension among the existing security personnel. At 42, Burke carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had built his reputation on other people's failures, and his pale blue eyes swept the convention center security setup with the dismissive gaze of a predator evaluating prey. Elena was briefing Agent Webb on the morning security status when Burke's voice cut through their conversation like a blade. His tone carried the particular brand of condescension reserved for people he considered beneath his notice, and Elena felt her stomach tighten with recognition even before she turned to face him. Well, Burke said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from every security professional within 50 feet. Elena Vasquez. I should have known I'd find you working private security in some backwater convention center. I guess failing out of sniper school really limited your career options. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, dragging her back to the worst day of her military career when Burke had stood over her prone form on the shooting range at Fort Sterling Tactical Academy, his voice dripping with satisfaction as he announced her failure to the assembled class. 3 years had passed since that humiliation, but the memory remained as sharp and painful as if it had happened yesterday. Agent Webb looked between Elena and Burke with the sharp attention of someone trained to read interpersonal dynamics. The transformation in Elena's posture was subtle but unmistakable, her confident bearing replaced by the rigid tension of someone preparing for battle. Burke's arrival had shifted the entire dynamic of the security operation, introducing an element of personal animosity that had no place in a presidential protection detail. Commander Burke, Elena said, her voice carefully neutral despite the rage building in her chest. I wasn't expecting Apex Solutions to be involved in this operation. Burke's smile was predatory as he stepped closer, invading Elena's personal space with the calculated aggression of a bully who had never faced real consequences for his behavior. The Secret Service requested additional tactical support for high-value target protection. Apparently, they wanted professionals who could actually hit their targets when it mattered. The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to humiliate Elena in front of the federal agents and local law enforcement officers who had spent the past week respecting her expertise. Burke had perfected the art of destroying confidence with carefully chosen words, and he wielded that skill like a weapon against anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image of tactical superiority. Director Patricia Hawkins emerged from the command center with the purposeful stride of someone who had been monitoring the confrontation through the building's extensive surveillance system. At 55, Hawkins had climbed through the Secret Service hierarchy by maintaining absolute focus on mission success over personal drama. But something about Burke's behavior triggered her protective instincts toward the security personnel, who had been working tirelessly to ensure presidential safety. "Commander Burke," Hawkins said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "I trust you're here to enhance our security posture, not to create interpersonal conflicts that could compromise operational effectiveness." Burke straightened slightly under Hawkins' direct gaze, but his expression remained smugly confident. "Director Hawkins, I'm simply ensuring that all personnel understand the level of professionalism required for presidential protection. Miss Vasquez here has a documented history of performance failures under pressure." The statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the collaborative atmosphere that Elena had worked so hard to build with the federal agents and local law enforcement officers. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring and judging. As Burke's words transformed her from a trusted security professional into a liability to be managed. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides as memories of Fort Sterling flooded back with devastating clarity. The final qualification shoot that would have earned her the coveted sniper designation, the single shot that sailed 3 inches wide of its target, due to an equipment malfunction that Burke had dismissed as user error. The public humiliation. As Burke announced her failure to a class that included several male Marines who had struggled with far more basic shooting skills but had been given second chances that Elena was denied. "My performance record speaks for itself," Elena said quietly, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I've maintained perfect security protocols for 3 years without a single incident." Burke's laugh was harsh and mocking, designed to be heard by everyone in the vicinity. "Maintaining security at corporate conferences is hardly comparable to protecting the President of the United States. This operation requires precision and reliability under extreme pressure, qualities that you've already proven you lack." Agent Webb stepped forward with the diplomatic instincts of someone who had spent years managing conflicts between competing agencies and egos. "Commander Burke, Miss Vasquez has been instrumental in our security preparations. Her knowledge of this facility is comprehensive, and her tactical assessments have been consistently accurate." "Tactical assessments from someone who couldn't pass basic sniper qualification," Burke replied dismissively. "I'm sure she's adequate for checking doors and monitoring cameras, but let's not pretend she belongs in discussions about counter-sniper operations or threat response protocols." The words cut deeper than Elena had expected, striking at insecurities she thought she had overcome during 3 years of rebuilding her life in the private sector. Burke's ability to reduce her accomplishments to insignificance, with a few carefully chosen phrases, demonstrated why he had been so effective at destroying the confidence of students who challenged his authority at Fort Sterling. Captain Lisa Park from the Phoenix Metro SWAT Division had been listening to the exchange with growing irritation. Park had worked with Elena extensively during the security preparations, and she had been impressed by the civilian contractor's understanding of urban sniper tactics and threat assessment protocols. Burke's casual dismissal of Elena's competence struck Park as both unprofessional and tactically dangerous. "Commander Burke," Park interjected, her voice carrying the steel of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. "Miss Vasquez identified potential threat vectors that my own sniper teams had overlooked. Her tactical analysis has been invaluable to our positioning and coverage planning." Burke turned his attention to Park with the same dismissive attitude he had shown Elena. "Captain, I'm sure Miss Vasquez is competent within her limitations, but this operation requires expertise that goes beyond identifying obvious vulnerabilities. We're dealing with potential threats from professional assassins who won't be deterred by conventional security measures." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a courier, carrying updated intelligence briefings from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The documents contained threat assessments based on social media monitoring and surveillance of known extremist groups, painting a picture of elevated risk that had prompted additional security measures throughout the downtown area. As the security leadership gathered to review the new intelligence, Burke positioned himself at the center of the discussion, while Elena found herself pushed to the periphery. The latest intelligence suggests coordinated threats from multiple vectors, Burke announced, taking charge of the briefing with practiced authority. We're looking at potential attacks from elevated positions, vehicle-borne explosive devices, and possible insider threats among local personnel. Elena listened with growing frustration as Burke outlined security measures that she had already implemented or recommended, presenting her ideas as his own insights while simultaneously dismissing her ability to contribute meaningfully to the discussion. His tactical knowledge was competent but unimaginative, relying on standard protocols rather than the creative threat assessment that had made Elena effective in her current role. Director Hawkins studied the intelligence reports with the analytical focus that had made her one of the Secret Service's most effective field commanders. Commander Burke, your team will coordinate with Captain Park's snipers on rooftop security. Agent Webb will manage building security protocols with existing personnel. Burke nodded with satisfaction, clearly expecting to be given operational control over the entire security detail. Director, I recommend replacing civilian contractors with professional operators for all critical positions. The stakes are too high to rely on personnel with questionable qualifications. The statement was obviously directed at Elena, whose presence Burke viewed as both a professional insult and a personal reminder of his own capacity for cruelty. Elena felt the familiar weight of judgment and dismissal settling on her shoulders, the same suffocating pressure she had experienced during the aftermath of her failure at Fort Sterling. Miss Vasquez will maintain her current responsibilities, Hawkins replied firmly. Her knowledge of this facility is irreplaceable, and her security assessments have been consistently reliable. Burke's expression darkened with barely concealed anger at having his recommendation rejected. Director, with respect, you're gambling with presidential security by maintaining personnel who have documented performance failures under pressure. Elena's composure finally cracked under the weight of Burke's relentless attacks on her competence and character. Commander Burke, my performance failure at Fort Sterling was the result of equipment malfunction that you refused to investigate. The rifle scope was damaged during transport, causing point-of-impact shift that made accurate shooting impossible. Burke's smile was cruel as he delivered his response. Equipment malfunctions are part of sniper operations, Miss Vasquez. A competent marksman adapts to changing conditions and maintains accuracy regardless of equipment issues. Your inability to compensate for scope problems demonstrated exactly why you weren't qualified for sniper designation. The exchange had drawn the attention of every security professional in the vicinity, creating exactly the kind of public humiliation that Burke had perfected during his years as a training instructor. Elena could feel their eyes on her, measuring her reaction and drawing conclusions about her fitness for the current operation, based on Burke's calculated character assassination. Agent Webb recognized the toxic dynamic developing between Burke and Elena, understanding that personal conflicts could compromise the entire security operation. Commander Burke, perhaps we should focus on coordinating our respective responsibilities rather than relitigating past training outcomes. Burke's response was swift and cutting. Agent Webb, past performance is the best predictor of future results. Miss Vasquez failed when precision mattered most, and that failure pattern doesn't disappear just because she's found work in private security. Elena's rage was building to dangerous levels, threatening to overwhelm the professional. Restraint she had maintained throughout Burke's systematic destruction of her reputation. The injustice of his attacks, combined with the memory of her unfair dismissal from sniper training, created a volatile emotional cocktail that demanded expression through action rather than words. My failure at Fort Sterling was engineered, by instructors who couldn't tolerate competence that threatened their authority, Elena said, her voice carrying across the command center with crystalline clarity. The equipment malfunction was documented by the range safety officer, but that documentation was suppressed to protect the reputation of training personnel, who had already decided I was unsuitable for sniper designation. Burke's expression shifted from smugness to genuine anger as Elena's words threatened to expose the institutional biases that had shaped her dismissal from the program. Miss Vasquez, your conspiracy theories about instructor bias don't change the fact that you missed a qualification shot that any competent marksman would have made. Your failure was complete and unambiguous. The accusation of conspiracy theories was the final insult that Elena could absorb without retaliation. 3 years of suppressed rage and professional frustration crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity as she realized that Burke's presence represented an opportunity for vindication that she had never expected to receive. If Burke wanted to make their conflict public, Elena was prepared to demonstrate exactly what kind of marksman she had become during 3 years of practicing with equipment that actually functioned properly. "Commander Burke," Elena said, her voice deadly calm, "if you're so concerned about my qualifications, perhaps we should settle this question definitively. Fort Sterling's training standards required hitting a target at 800 meters under combat conditions. I'm willing to demonstrate my current capabilities whenever you're ready to observe." Burke's confidence wavered slightly as Elena's challenge registered, but his pride prevented him from backing down from a confrontation he had initiated. "Miss Vasquez, this isn't training camp. We're preparing for presidential protection, not conducting remedial marksmanship training for failed snipers." Director Hawkins had been observing the escalating conflict with growing concern, recognizing that personal animosity between security personnel could create vulnerabilities that hostile forces might exploit. "Commander Burke, Miss Vasquez, this discussion ends now. We have 48 hours before the President's arrival, and personal conflicts will not compromise our security posture." Elena nodded her acceptance of Hawkins' directive, but something fundamental had changed in her relationship with the operation. Burke's attacks had stripped away the careful professional facade she had maintained for 3 years, exposing the warrior mentality that had never truly disappeared beneath her civilian contractor identity. If Burke wanted to question her qualifications publicly, Elena was prepared to provide answers that would shock everyone who had accepted his version of her capabilities. As the security teams dispersed to their respective assignments, Elena found herself isolated in a way that felt all too familiar from her final days at Fort Sterling. Burke had succeeded in poisoning the collaborative atmosphere she had worked to build, transforming her from a trusted team member into a questionable asset who required careful management. The injustice of the situation burned in her chest like acid, but Elena had learned patience during 3 years of invisible competence. Burke's presence had introduced an element of personal vendetta into an operation that demanded absolute focus on presidential protection. Elena understood that her opportunity for vindication would come not through arguments or explanations, but through demonstration of capabilities that Burke had dismissed as non-existent. The next 48 hours would reveal whether her 3 years of private practice had transformed her into the marksman that Fort Sterling's training had tried to create, or whether Burke's assessment of her limitations would prove prophetic. When precision mattered most, standing alone in the security office as the evening shift prepared to take over, Elena felt the familiar weight of expectation and judgment settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring the President's advance team and final security preparations. The day after that, President Morrison would arrive for an address that was supposed to represent routine political theater. Elena had spent 3 years preparing for a moment she never expected to face again, but Burke's challenge had made that confrontation inevitable. The only question remaining was whether her hidden capabilities would prove sufficient when lives hung in the balance and failure meant consequences far beyond personal humiliation. The morning of President Morrison's arrival dawned with an unseasonable desert wind that rattled the windows of downtown Phoenix and sent dust devils dancing across the convention center's plaza. Elena stood on the roof of the building, her hair whipping around her face as she conducted her final security sweep before the presidential motorcade arrived. The wind would complicate any long-range shooting, creating variables that even experienced marksmen struggled to calculate accurately. She made mental notes of the wind patterns, the way the gusts shifted direction between buildings, and the thermal currents rising from sun-heated concrete that could deflect a bullet by several inches at extended range. At precisely 10:30 in the morning, the presidential motorcade swept through downtown Phoenix with the choreographed precision of a military operation. The iconic presidential limousine, surrounded by identical decoy vehicles and bristling with communication equipment, rolled through streets that had been cleared of traffic and lined with law enforcement officers. Overhead, helicopter gunships maintained overwatch while Secret Service counter-sniper teams tracked potential threats from rooftop positions throughout the downtown corridor. Elena watched from the convention center's security command post as President Morrison emerged from the armored vehicle with the practiced grace of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. At 58, Catherine Morrison carried herself with the confident bearing of a leader who understood that every public appearance was both political theater and potential target for those who opposed her policies. Her security detail moved with fluid efficiency, creating protective formations that appeared casual but represented years of training in threat assessment and response protocols. The president's arrival triggered a cascade of security protocols that transformed the convention center into a fortress bristling with sensors, cameras, and armed personnel. Elena coordinated with federal agents and local law enforcement officers, her calm competence earning nods of approval from professionals who had initially questioned her qualifications after Burke's public attacks on her credibility. Despite Burke's efforts to undermine her position, Elena's knowledge of the building and her tactical insights had proven too valuable to dismiss. Commander Burke positioned his Apex Solutions team at strategic points throughout the security perimeter, his tactical operators wearing full combat gear that seemed excessive for what was supposed to be a routine political address. Burke himself occupied the primary command post, from where he could monitor all security communications and coordinate responses to potential threats. His presence cast a shadow over the operation, introducing an element of personal animosity that had no place in presidential protection protocols. President Morrison's speech was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, addressing an audience of business leaders, political figures, and economic experts who had gathered for the Western Economic Summit. The convention center's main auditorium had been transformed into a secure environment with multiple layers of screening and surveillance. But Elena's attention remained focused on the external threats that posed the greatest danger to presidential safety. At 1:45, Elena noticed the anomaly that would change everything. The catering truck from Southwest Premium Foods that had troubled her since its appearance on the delivery schedule was parked in the service area behind the convention center, but something about its positioning struck her as deliberately strategic rather than functionally necessary. The truck was angled to provide clear sightlines to the main auditorium while remaining partially concealed behind a maintenance building. Elena's pulse quickened as she studied the vehicle through binoculars, noting details that transformed suspicion into certainty. The truck's rear doors were slightly ajar, despite regulations requiring all service vehicles to remain sealed during presidential visits. The driver had disappeared shortly after parking, abandoning the vehicle in violation of security protocols that required all delivery personnel to remain with their vehicles until cleared by security teams. Most significantly, Elena observed movement within the truck's cargo area, shadows shifting in patterns that suggested human presence rather than catering equipment. She reached for her radio to report the suspicious vehicle, but her transmission was interrupted by Burke's voice, cutting across the security frequency with characteristic arrogance. "All units, this is command. We have reports of a possible suspicious person on the roof of the Bank of Arizona building. All counter-sniper teams redirect to that location immediately." Elena felt ice form in her stomach as she realized that Burke's order was diverting attention from the real threat, while creating exactly the kind of distraction that professional assassins use to execute complex operations. The Bank of Arizona building had been thoroughly cleared and secured, making it an unlikely location for an actual threat. But responding to Burke's order would pull protective assets away from the convention center at the most critical moment. "Command, this is Vasquez," Elena transmitted, her voice urgent but controlled. "I have eyes on a suspicious vehicle in the service area. Catering truck showing signs of hostile occupation. Request immediate response team to investigate." Burke's response was swift and dismissive. "Vasquez, maintain your assigned position and do not interfere with federal operations. The threat has been identified and is being addressed by qualified personnel." Elena's training and instincts screamed that Burke was making a catastrophic error, whether through incompetence or something far worse. The timing of the supposed threat on the Bank of Arizona building was too convenient, creating exactly the kind of diversion that would allow the real attack to proceed unimpeded. She found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life: obey orders and watch potential disaster unfold, or act on her convictions despite the consequences. President Morrison took the stage at exactly 2 o'clock, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system as she began her address on economic cooperation and trade policy. Elena watched through the security monitors as the president moved with confident gestures, unaware that 847 meters away, a sniper was making final preparations for an assassination attempt that would shock the world. Elena abandoned her assigned position and moved toward the building's service elevator, her mind calculating distances, angles, and response times with the precision that had made her effective in Afghanistan before Fort Sterling destroyed her. Confidence. The elevator carried her to the 23rd floor, where renovation work had left the southeast corner apartment empty and accessible through construction access points that Elena had noted during her security surveys. The apartment's windows provided an unobstructed view of the service area, where the suspicious catering truck remained positioned. Through her binoculars, Elena could now clearly see the muzzle of a high-powered rifle protruding from the truck's rear doors, aimed directly at the convention center's main auditorium. The sniper was invisible from ground level, but clearly visible from Elena's elevated position, creating an opportunity for interdiction that would exist for only moments before the assassin took his shot. Elena's radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications as Burke's supposed threat on the Bank of Arizona building proved to be non-existent, but by then the diversion had achieved its purpose. Counter-sniper teams were out of position, response units were committed to the wrong location, and the real threat remained undetected by everyone, except the woman who had been dismissed as unqualified for precision shooting. Elena retrieved her personal rifle from the construction equipment where she had hidden it 3 days earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of scenario despite hoping it would never materialize. The weapon was a custom-built precision instrument that represented 3 years of careful modification and practice, designed to deliver accuracy that surpassed anything she had used during her military service. Every component had been selected and adjusted to compensate for the equipment failures that had destroyed her reputation at Fort Sterling. The distance to the target was 847 meters, complicated by crosswinds gusting to 15 miles per hour and thermal currents that created shimmer effects in the dry desert air. Elena's calculations had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the fact that she would be shooting through glass that would deflect her bullet by several inches if she didn't compensate properly. The shot was technically possible, but required precision that few marksmen could achieve under ideal conditions, much less in the chaos of an active assassination attempt. Elena settled into a prone shooting position, her body automatically assuming the stable firing stance that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training and combat experience. The rifle's scope revealed the sniper in crystalline detail, a professional operator, wearing tactical gear and using equipment that suggested military training and substantial financial backing. His finger was moving toward the trigger as president. Morrison reached a crucial point in her speech, unaware that death was measuring the distance between her podium and eternity. Time compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity as Elena made the calculations that would determine whether President Morrison lived or died. Wind speed and direction, target movement, bullet trajectory, and the margin of error that separated success from catastrophic failure. Elena's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm that preceded every important shot, her heart rate dropping as combat conditioning overrode the adrenaline that threatened to destabilize her aim. The crosshairs settled on the assassin's center mass as Elena began her trigger squeeze, applying pressure with the steady control that had made her lethal in Afghanistan and would either vindicate or destroy her in Phoenix. The rifle's recoil was familiar and comforting, a physical reminder of capabilities that had never truly disappeared despite 3 years of official dismissal and professional exile. 847 meters away, Elena's bullet struck the assassin in the upper torso with devastating precision, the impact spinning him away from his rifle and destroying his ability to complete the shot that would have killed President Morrison. The sound of Elena's rifle echoed across downtown Phoenix like thunder, announcing to the world that someone had just prevented a presidential assassination with marksmanship that defied every assumption about her capabilities. The convention center erupted into controlled chaos as Secret Service agents implemented emergency protocols, rushing President Morrison to safety while tactical teams converged on the service area where the wounded assassin lay beside his disabled rifle. Elena watched through her scope as medical personnel attended to the man she had shot, confirming that he was alive but incapacitated, an outcome that preserved the possibility of intelligence gathering while eliminating the immediate threat to presidential safety. Burke's voice cut across the security frequency with barely controlled panic as he struggled to understand how his carefully orchestrated diversion had failed to protect the real attack. All units, shots fired from unknown location. Secure the president immediately and identify the shooter. Elena remained motionless in her concealed position, understanding that revealing herself would trigger a response that could easily result in her death at the hands of security personnel who had been trained to eliminate threats without hesitation. She had saved the president's life, but explaining how a civilian contractor had acquired the skills and equipment necessary for such a shot would require revelations that she wasn't prepared to make. Agent Webb's voice emerged from the chaos with professional calm that cut through the confusion like a blade. "Command, this is Webb. The threat has been neutralized by unknown friendly fire. Repeat, the assassin is down and the president is secure. We need to identify our guardian angel before someone shoots them by mistake." Elena slowly raised her hands above her head and began the delicate process of emerging from her concealed position without triggering a fatal response from the dozens of armed personnel who were now flooding the downtown area. She left her rifle behind, understanding that approaching security personnel while armed would be tantamount to suicide. But she carried her identification and the documentation that proved her authorized presence in the building. "Director Hawkins." Voice crackled across the radio frequency with steel-edged authority. "All units, hold fire. We have a potential friendly shooter who just saved the president's life. I want them brought to me alive and unharmed for debriefing." Elena descended through the building with her hands visible and her movements deliberately slow, knowing that nervous security personnel were tracking her through scopes and that A single sudden movement could end her life despite her heroic intervention. The elevator carried her back to the main floor, where she emerged to find herself surrounded by a circle of armed agents whose weapons were trained on her with deadly precision. Elena Vasquez, Blackwater Security Solutions, she announced clearly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent years in life-or-death situations. I'm the one who took the shot. The assassin is neutralized, and President Morrison is safe. Agent Webb pushed through the circle of armed personnel, his expression mixing relief with incredulous amazement as he recognized the woman who had just demonstrated marksmanship capabilities that seemed impossible for someone with her official qualifications. Elena, how in the hell did you make that shot? 800 meters in crosswinds with a moving target? Elena met his gaze steadily, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that surrounded them. The same way I made every shot in Afghanistan before Fort Sterling, convinced everyone I couldn't hit the broad side of a barn. The rifle worked properly this time. Burke arrived at the scene with his tactical team, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something approaching fear as he realized that Elena's impossible shot had exposed every assumption he had made about her capabilities. The woman he had publicly dismissed as a failed sniper had just accomplished something that few marksmen in the world could have achieved, and her success made his own tactical failures look catastrophic by comparison. "This is impossible," Burke said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. Elena Vasquez failed sniper qualification. She's not capable of precision shooting at extended range. Elena turned to face Burke with the calm confidence of someone who had just proven every doubt wrong through action rather than argument. "Commander Burke, my failure at Fort Sterling was the result of equipment sabotage designed to eliminate a candidate who threatened your training program's bias against women. Today I used properly functioning equipment to save the president's life. I'd say that settles the question of my capabilities definitively." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, transforming Burke from confident authority figure into someone whose reputation and career were suddenly under threat. Elena's successful shot had done more than save President Morrison's life. It had exposed the institutional corruption that had destroyed her military career and countless others who had been sacrificed to protect the egos of instructors who couldn't tolerate competence that exceeded their own. Director Hawkins approached Elena with the measured steps of someone trying to process information that challenged every assumption about the security operation she had commanded. "Miss Vasquez, that was an extraordinary shot under impossible conditions. Where did you acquire the training and equipment necessary for that level of precision?" Elena's smile was sad but peaceful as she considered her response. "Director Hawkins, I acquired the training in the mountains of Afghanistan, where missing meant my brothers didn't come home. I acquired the equipment during 3 years of practice with rifles that actually fired where they were aimed. The only thing I acquired today was the opportunity to prove that competence doesn't disappear just because someone with authority says it doesn't exist." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as additional law enforcement and medical personnel converged on the scene, but Elena's attention remained focused on the moment of vindication that had been 3 years in the making. She had saved the president's life with a shot that Burke had claimed was beyond her capabilities, exposing every lie and assumption that had been used to destroy her career and exile her from the profession she loved. Standing in the circle of armed agents and tactical personnel, Elena understood that her life would never be the same. The impossible shot that had neutralized the assassin would bring attention and scrutiny that would force her to confront questions she had spent 3 years avoiding. But for the first time since Fort Sterling, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that her skills had been used to protect innocent life rather than destroy it. President Morrison was safe, the assassin was neutralized, and Elena Vasquez had finally proven that some truths could not be buried by institutional bias or personal cruelty. The question now was whether the system that had destroyed her once would have the courage to acknowledge its mistakes, or whether saving a president's life would simply bring new forms of persecution from those who could not admit their own failures. The interrogation room at the Phoenix FBI field office felt like a tomb, its gray walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of clinical detachment that seemed designed to strip away pretense and force uncomfortable truths into the open. Elena sat across from a panel of federal investigators, her hands steady on the metal table despite 48 hours of continuous questioning that had probed every aspect of her background, training, and the impossible shot that had saved President Morrison's life. The woman who had been dismissed as a failed sniper 3 years earlier now found herself at the center of the most intensive federal investigation since the Kennedy assassination. Special Agent in Charge Robert Chun led the questioning with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades extracting truth from people trained to withstand interrogation. At 53, Chun had investigated everything from domestic terrorism to foreign espionage, but Elena's case represented something unique in his experience. The shot that had neutralized the presidential assassin required capabilities that should not have existed in someone with Elena's official qualifications, creating questions that threatened to expose institutional failure spanning multiple agencies and military branches. "Miss Vasquez," Chun began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of high-stakes investigations. "The ballistics analysis confirms that your shot traveled 847 meters through variable crosswinds before striking the target with precision that our weapons experts describe as impossible under the conditions present. The mathematical probability of success for that shot, given your equipment and the environmental factors, was less than 12% for even the most experienced military snipers." Elena met Chun's gaze with the steady composure of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this kind of scrutiny. "Special Agent Chun, the probability calculations assume standard military equipment and training protocols. My rifle was custom-built to compensate for specific environmental factors, and my training extends beyond what appears in my official records." The statement triggered a flurry of activity among the investigators, who had been struggling to reconcile Elena's documented failure at Fort Sterling with marksmanship that surpassed elite military standards. Deputy Director Sarah Martinez, from the Department of Homeland Security, leaned forward with the intensity of someone pursuing answers that could reshape national security protocols. "Miss Vasquez, your military service record shows distinguished performance as a designated marksman in Afghanistan, but it also documents your failure to qualify for advanced sniper training at Fort Sterling Tactical Academy. The contradiction between your documented capabilities and your recent performance suggests information that hasn't been disclosed to this investigation." Elena's expression hardened as the conversation turned toward Fort Sterling, dredging up memories of humiliation and injustice that had shaped 3 years of exile from the profession she loved. Deputy Director Martinez, my failure at Fort Sterling was engineered by instructors who couldn't tolerate competence that threatened their authority. The equipment malfunction that caused my qualification failure was documented, but subsequently suppressed to protect the reputation of training personnel. The accusation sent ripples of tension through the interrogation room, introducing the possibility that Elena's case represented not just individual injustice, but systemic corruption that could implicate dozens of military personnel and training protocols. General Patricia Wolf, representing the Pentagon's Internal Investigation Unit, studied Elena with the calculating gaze of someone trying to assess the potential damage to military reputation and training programs. "Miss Vasquez," General Wolf said carefully, "you're alleging that Fort Sterling instructors deliberately sabotaged your training to ensure your failure. That's a serious accusation that would require substantial evidence to support." Elena reached into the document folder that had been returned to her after security screening, extracting a manila envelope that contained materials she had been collecting for 3 years in preparation for exactly this moment. General Wolf, the evidence has been available the entire time. The question is whether anyone in authority was willing to examine it objectively. The documents Elena spread across the metal table painted a devastating picture of institutional corruption and bias that extended far beyond her individual case. Range safety reports documenting equipment failures that had been ignored or suppressed. Testimony from other female candidates who had experienced similar treatment. Financial records showing connections between Fort Sterling instructors and private military contractors who benefited from maintaining artificial scarcity in sniper-qualified personnel. The most damning evidence came in the form of electronic communications that Elena had obtained through a former Fort Sterling instructor, whose conscience had finally overcome his fear of retaliation. The messages revealed a coordinated effort to eliminate female candidates from advanced training programs, using equipment sabotage and manufactured performance failures to maintain the program's traditional male-only culture. Special Agent Chun studied the communications with the focused attention of someone recognizing evidence that could support criminal prosecutions. Miss Vasquez, these communications appear to show deliberate conspiracy to discriminate against female candidates. How did you obtain these materials? Elena's smile carried no warmth as she considered the 3 years of patient investigation that had led to this moment. Master Sergeant William Torres contacted me 18 months ago. His daughter applied for sniper training and experienced the same treatment I received. Sergeant Torres had access to Fort Sterling's electronic communications system and decided that protecting his daughter was more important than protecting corrupt instructors. The revelation that Elena's evidence came from an active duty military source added credibility to her allegations while simultaneously expanding the scope of the investigation. General Wolf's expression shifted from skepticism to concern, as she realized that Elena's case might represent the tip of an iceberg that could destroy careers and reputations throughout the military training establishment. Agent Webb, who had been observing the interrogation from behind one-way glass, entered the room with additional evidence that had emerged from the investigation of the assassination attempt. Elena, we've completed our analysis of the assassins, equipment and background. The scope on his rifle was military-grade precision optics worth more than most soldiers make in a year. This wasn't some lone fanatic with a hunting rifle. The information confirmed Elena's suspicions that the assassination attempt represented a sophisticated operation with professional backing and advanced equipment. The assassin, identified as Markus Volkov, was a former Russian military sniper, with connections to international criminal organizations and a documented history of political assassinations. His presence in Phoenix and his access to advanced equipment suggested coordination with hostile foreign intelligence services. Deputy Director Martinez connected the implications with growing alarm. If Volkov was part of a foreign-sponsored assassination plot, then Miss Vasquez's intervention prevented what could have been an act of war disguised as domestic terrorism. The strategic implications of President Morrison's death would have destabilized American foreign policy for decades. Elena listened to the expanding revelations with the grim satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been vindicated by events. Her suspicions about the catering truck, her recognition of the threat that others had missed, and her decision to act despite Burke's dismissive orders had prevented a catastrophe that could have changed the course of history. The impossible shot that had saved President Morrison's life was beginning to look less like luck and more like the inevitable result of superior training and tactical awareness. The interrogation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Burke, whose presence had been requested by the investigating team to address Elena's allegations about Fort Sterling and the equipment failures that had destroyed her military career. Burke entered the room with visible reluctance, his usual swagger replaced by the defensive posture of someone facing accusations that could end his career and reputation. General Wolfe addressed Burke with the stern authority of someone whose patience for institutional corruption had been exhausted by 3 days of revelations. Commander Burke, Miss Vasquez has presented evidence suggesting that her failure at Fort Sterling was the result of deliberate equipment sabotage designed to eliminate female candidates from sniper training. What is your response to these allegations? Burke's response was immediate and defensive, delivered with the aggressive confidence of someone who had spent years deflecting criticism through intimidation rather than evidence. General Wolfe, Miss Vasquez failed sniper qualification because she lacked the mental toughness and technical competence required for precision shooting under pressure. Her conspiracy theories about equipment sabotage are attempts to rationalize performance failures that were obvious to everyone present. Elena's voice cut through Burke's dismissal with the quiet authority of someone presenting facts rather than opinions. Commander Burke, the Range Safety Officer's report documented scope mounting problems that caused a 3-inch point of impact shift at 800 meters. That report was filed 20 minutes after my qualification attempt and subsequently disappeared from Fort Sterling's record system. Burke's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching panic as Elena's specific knowledge of suppressed documentation threatened to expose the systematic nature of the corruption. At Fort Sterling, Miss Vasquez, equipment malfunctions are part of sniper operations. Competent marksmen adapt to changing conditions and maintain accuracy regardless of technical difficulties. Special Agent Chun interrupted Burke's explanation with evidence that had emerged from the FBI's investigation of Fort Sterling's training records. Commander Burke, our forensic analysis of Fort Sterling's computer systems recovered deleted files showing that equipment failure reports were systematically suppressed during your tenure as chief instructor. Miss Vasquez's case was one of 17 similar incidents involving female candidates. The revelation that Elena's experience represented part of a broader pattern of discrimination and corruption transformed the interrogation from an individual case review into an investigation of institutional failure that implicated dozens of military personnel and training protocols. Burke's role as the architect of systematic bias was becoming impossible to deny in the face of electronic evidence that documented his deliberate efforts to eliminate qualified female candidates. Deputy Director Martinez pressed the investigation deeper into the systemic issues that Elena's case had exposed. Commander Burke, the suppressed reports show that you personally overrode range safety officers who documented equipment failures affecting female candidates. What was your justification for ignoring documented technical problems? Burke's response revealed the depth of institutional bias that had shaped his decision-making throughout his career at Fort Sterling. Deputy Director Martinez, sniper. Training requires absolute precision under combat conditions. Candidates who cannot adapt to equipment variations lack the mental flexibility required for real-world operations. Elena's laugh was bitter as she recognized the circular logic that Burke had used to justify years of discrimination and career destruction. Commander Burke, you're arguing that female candidates should be eliminated for equipment failures that male candidates were never required to overcome. The double standard wasn't about mental flexibility. It was about maintaining artificial barriers to preserve traditional gender roles. The accusation struck at the heart of the institutional culture that had enabled Burke's behavior and protected him from accountability for years of systematic discrimination. General Wolfe's expression reflected growing recognition that Fort Sterling's problems extended far beyond individual bias into cultural patterns that had infected military training at the highest levels. Agent Webb introduced additional evidence that connected Elena's case to broader national security implications. Elena, our investigation of Commander Burke's financial records shows payments from Crimson Defense Solutions, a private military contractor that specializes in providing sniper services to foreign governments. Burke's artificial restriction of sniper-qualified personnel created artificial scarcity that drove up Crimson's contract values. The revelation that Burke had been receiving payments from private contractors who benefited from restricting sniper training added financial corruption to the charges of discrimination and institutional bias. Elena's failure at Fort Sterling hadn't just been about gender discrimination. It had been part of a deliberate scheme to limit the supply of qualified snipers in order to increase the value of private military services. Elena studied Burke with the cold assessment of someone finally understanding the full scope of the corruption that had destroyed her military career. Commander Burke, you didn't just fail female candidates to protect your ego. You failed qualified candidates to create artificial scarcity that benefited your private sector employers. My destroyed career was just collateral damage in your personal enrichment scheme. Burke's composure finally cracked under the weight of evidence that threatened to expose years of criminal corruption disguised as training standards. Miss Vasquez, you have no proof that my training decisions were influenced by external financial considerations. My evaluation of candidate performance was based on objective military standards. Special Agent Chun placed a series of bank statements and wire transfer records on the table between Burke and Elena, documents that painted a clear picture of corruption spanning multiple years and involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal payments. Commander Burke, these financial records show a direct correlation between your rejection of qualified candidates and payments from Crimson Defense Solutions. The pattern suggests systematic fraud rather than legitimate training evaluation. The evidence was overwhelming, transforming Burke from confident authority figure into someone whose criminal behavior had been exposed through Elena's impossible shot and the investigation it had triggered. The woman he had dismissed as a failed sniper had not only saved the president's life, but had also exposed the corruption that had destroyed her career and countless others. General Wolfe addressed the room with the grim authority of someone authorized to make decisions that would reshape military training and accountability. This investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic corruption, discrimination, and fraud that undermines the integrity of our most critical training programs. Commander Burke, you are hereby relieved of all duties pending court-martial proceedings on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Burke's arrest and the exposure of the Fort Sterling corruption represented vindication that Elena had never expected to receive. But the satisfaction was tempered by recognition of the careers that had been destroyed and the national security implications of systematic training failures. Her impossible shot had done more than save President Morrison's life. It had exposed institutional rot that threatened the effectiveness of American military operations around the world. As the interrogation concluded and Elena prepared to face an uncertain future, she understood that her journey from failed sniper to presidential savior had revealed truths that would reshape military training and accountability for years to come. The question now was whether the system that had destroyed her once would have the courage to acknowledge its failures and implement the reforms necessary to prevent future corruption. 6 months after the assassination attempt that changed everything, Elena stood at the edge of a shooting range carved into the mountains outside Prescott, Arizona, watching a group of women transform their relationship with precision and power. The Precision Leadership Academy occupied 50 acres of high desert terrain, its facilities designed not just for marksmanship, training, but for rebuilding confidence that had been systematically destroyed by institutional bias and personal cruelty. The morning sun cast long shadows across the range where Elena's students were preparing for their final qualification shoots, each woman carrying her own story of dreams deferred and capabilities dismissed. The offer from Director Hawkins had come 3 weeks after the FBI completed its investigation into the Fort Sterling corruption scandal. Full reinstatement to active duty with immediate promotion to major, command of the Secret Service's newly created counter-sniper division, and a salary that would have made Elena financially secure for life. The Pentagon had sweetened the deal with promises of congressional testimony that would expose the full scope of military training, corruption, and reforms that would prevent future discrimination against qualified candidates. Elena had listened to the offers with the patient attention of someone who understood that vindication and opportunity were not the same thing as justice or fulfillment. The system that had destroyed her career was now eager to claim credit for her capabilities, rewriting history to position her impossible shot as validation of institutional excellence rather than evidence of institutional failure. The same officials who had ignored years of documented corruption were now competing to associate themselves with the woman who had saved a president's life. President Morrison herself had extended a personal invitation for Elena to join her security detail, acknowledging in a private meeting that Elena's intervention had prevented not just presidential assassination but potential war with foreign powers who had sponsored the attack. The president's gratitude was genuine and her respect was evident, but Elena recognized that accepting the position would mean returning to a system that had not fundamentally changed despite the exposure of Burke's criminal behavior. The decision to decline all government offers had surprised everyone except Elena herself, who had spent 3 years learning to measure success by standards that had nothing to do with rank, recognition, or official validation. The Precision Leadership Academy represented something that government service could never provide: the opportunity to transform individual lives while building something entirely new rather than reforming something fundamentally broken. Maria Santos, a former Army medic who had been dismissed from combat training for supposed lack of physical strength, lined up her shot with the methodical concentration that Elena had been teaching for the past 4 months. At 26, Maria carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had learned to prove competence through performance rather than argument. Her target stood at 600 meters, a distance that would have been impossible for her to engage accurately 6 months earlier, but now represented a routine demonstration of skills that had always existed beneath institutional dismissal. "Remember your breathing pattern," Elena called out, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her effective as both a teacher and a marksman. "The shot breaks when your body is ready, not when your mind thinks it should happen." The rifle's report echoed across the desert landscape as Maria's bullet found its mark with precision that would have impressed elite military snipers. Elena watched through her spotting scope as the impact struck within inches of the target's center, confirming that another woman had discovered capabilities that others had claimed did not exist. The transformation was always remarkable to witness, but Elena never tired of seeing confidence bloom in people who had been taught to accept artificial limitations. Tommy Rodriguez had followed Elena from Phoenix to help establish the Academy's facilities, bringing his decades of maintenance expertise and his genuine belief in her mission. At 54, Tommy understood that Elena's work extended far beyond marksmanship training into territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about competence, leadership, and the systems that elevated some people while destroying others. His presence provided stability and institutional memory that grounded Elena's vision in practical realities. "Elena," Tommy said as he approached the firing line, "we've got visitors from the State Department coming next week. They want to discuss contracts for training female security personnel from allied nations. Apparently, word about what you're doing here has reached some interesting places." Elena nodded acknowledgement while maintaining her focus on Maria's continued shooting sequence. The Academy had attracted attention from unexpected sources as news of Elena's impossible shot and the subsequent corruption revelations spread through government and military networks. Foreign governments whose female personnel faced similar institutional barriers had begun inquiring about training programs that could develop capabilities without requiring navigation of biased institutional structures. The success stories were accumulating with impressive consistency. validating Elena's belief that competence existed in places that traditional systems refused to recognize. Jennifer Park, a former police officer who had been denied SWAT team membership despite superior test scores, now consistently outshot male officers who had dismissed her applications. Rebecca Torres, whose brother had provided Elena with the evidence that exposed Fort Sterling's corruption, had become one of the Academy's most gifted instructors after her own military career was derailed by discrimination. Agent Webb arrived at the Academy in the late afternoon, carrying documents that bore the official seals of multiple federal agencies and wearing the expression of someone delivering news that he wasn't certain Elena would want to receive. Webb had become Elena's primary liaison with federal law enforcement during the months following the assassination attempt, serving as a bridge between her civilian status and the ongoing investigations that her shot had triggered. "Elena," Webb said as they walked toward the Academy's administrative building, "the Senate Intelligence Committee wants to offer you a consulting contract for threat assessment and counter-sniper training. They're willing to pay consultant rates that would dwarf anything you could make in government service, and you'd maintain complete independence from military command structures." Elena considered the offer while watching her students conduct equipment maintenance with the meticulous attention to detail that she had drilled into them over months of training. The federal consulting contract represented recognition and financial security, but it also represented a return to the institutional world that had shaped her understanding of what she didn't want her life to become. "Marcus," Elena said, using Webb's first name in acknowledgement of the friendship that had developed during their professional association. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm building something here that's more important than any contract the government could provide. These women are discovering capabilities that the system told them didn't exist. That's worth more than any consulting fee." Webb studied Elena with the analytical attention that had made him effective as a federal agent, recognizing that her refusal represented something deeper than simple preference for civilian life. "Elena, you saved the president's life with a shot that most experts considered impossible. You exposed corruption that had been destroying careers for years. Don't you want to use those capabilities in service to your country?" Elena's smile carried the peaceful certainty of someone who had found purpose that transcended traditional measures of service and success. "Marcus, I am serving my country. I'm serving it by building something that proves competence exists in places where the system refuses to look for it. Every woman who leaves this academy with confidence in her capabilities makes our country stronger in ways that no government position could achieve." The academy's evening routine included a communal dinner where students and instructors shared not just meals but stories of the journeys that had brought them to Elena's program. The conversations revealed patterns of institutional bias and personal resilience that connected women from military, law enforcement, and private security backgrounds in their shared experiences of having capabilities dismissed or deliberately undermined. Maria Santos shared her story of being denied combat medic advancement despite superior performance in every technical evaluation, explaining how supervisors had cited concerns about her ability to carry wounded soldiers despite evidence that her endurance exceeded male peers. Jennifer Park described police department politics that had kept her from specialized units, despite test scores that qualified her for leadership positions. Rebecca Torres recounted the family loyalty that had driven her brother to risk his military career by exposing Fort Sterling's corruption. Elena listened to these stories with the deep attention of someone who understood that each narrative represented not just individual injustice, but systematic failure that undermined institutional effectiveness. The women around the dinner table possessed capabilities that their original organizations had refused to recognize, creating a reservoir of talent that Elena's academy was finally allowing to flourish. "The thing that surprises me most," said Dr. Angela Chun, a former military psychologist who had joined the academy as a counselor and instructor, is how quickly confidence returns once the institutional barriers are removed. These women didn't need to develop new capabilities. They needed permission to use the capabilities they already possessed. The observation captured something essential about Elena's approach to training and leadership development. Rather than attempting to transform students into something they weren't, the Academy focused on removing the artificial limitations that had been imposed by systems designed to exclude rather than evaluate. The results spoke for themselves in the form of marksmanship scores that rivaled elite military units and tactical awareness that exceeded conventional training programs. Commander Burke's court-martial had concluded 2 months earlier with convictions on 17 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His 20-year sentence had sent shockwaves through military training establishments, serving notice that systematic corruption would no longer be tolerated regardless of the personal relationships and institutional cultures that had previously protected such behavior. Burke's disgrace had vindicated Elena's allegations, while creating space for reforms that would benefit future generations of military personnel. The broader investigation into Fort Sterling had resulted in the dismissal of 12 instructors and the complete overhaul of training protocols designed to eliminate bias and ensure fair evaluation of all candidates. General Wolfe had personally overseen the reforms, implementing changes that included independent oversight of qualification chutes and mandatory documentation of all equipment issues that could affect candidate performance. Elena received regular updates on the institutional changes that her impossible shot had triggered, but her attention remained focused on the individual transformations occurring within her own program. The systemic reforms were important for preventing future injustice, but the Academy represented something more immediate and tangible, proof that excellence could flourish when artificial barriers were removed and authentic support was provided. The Academy's success had attracted funding from unexpected sources, including private foundations focused on women's leadership development and corporations seeking to diversify their security operations with demonstrably superior talent. Elena had been careful to maintain independence from any single funding source, understanding that financial dependence could compromise the mission in ways that government oversight never could. President Morrison visited the Academy on an unannounced trip 6 months after the assassination attempt, arriving with minimal security detail and genuine curiosity about the program that had trained the woman who saved her life. The president spent 3 hours observing training sessions and speaking privately with students about their experiences, leaving with visible respect for what Elena had accomplished. "Miss Vasquez," President Morrison said during their private conversation, "you had every right to be bitter about the treatment you received. But instead you've built something that makes our entire country stronger. That's a form of leadership that can't be taught in any government program." Elena accepted the president's gratitude with the quiet dignity that had characterized her response to all forms of recognition and vindication. "Madam President, the best revenge against injustice is building something better than what destroyed you. These women deserve the opportunity to prove their capabilities, and providing that opportunity has been the most meaningful work of my life." The conversation highlighted something fundamental about Elena's approach to success and vindication. Rather than seeking to punish those who had wronged her or to reclaim position within the system that had rejected her, Elena had chosen to create entirely new possibilities that transcended the limitations of traditional institutional structures. Her impossible shot had saved a president's life, but her Academy was saving dozens of lives by proving that excellence existed in places where others refused to look. The Academy's first graduation ceremony took place on a crisp December morning, with families, friends, and professional colleagues gathering to witness achievements that many had been told were impossible. 23 women crossed the stage to receive certifications in precision marksmanship, tactical awareness, and leadership development, each carrying credentials that would open doors previously closed to them. Elena watched the ceremony with the deep satisfaction of someone who had discovered that true victory meant lifting others rather than climbing over them. The women graduating from her program would go on to careers in law enforcement, military service, private security, and corporate leadership, carrying with them not just technical skills, but unshakable confidence in their ability to excel in any environment that valued competence over compliance. Agent Webb served as the ceremony's keynote speaker, addressing the graduates with words that captured something essential about Elena's mission and its broader implications for American society. 6 months ago, Elena Vasquez proved that excellence can emerge from the most unexpected places when given proper support and genuine opportunity. Today, each of you represents proof that her intervention was not just about saving one life, but about transforming many lives. The graduates' achievements extended far beyond marksmanship scores and tactical evaluations into territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership, competence, and the systems designed to identify and develop human potential. Several had already received job offers from federal agencies seeking to diversify their tactical units with demonstrably superior talent. Others had been recruited by private security firms that valued proven performance over traditional credentials. Maria Santos would be joining the FBI's hostage rescue team as its first female sniper, bringing capabilities that had been developed at Elena's academy to federal law enforcement operations around the world. Jennifer Park had been selected for a leadership position with a multinational security corporation that specialized in protecting corporate executives in hostile environments. Rebecca Torres was establishing her own training program focused on developing marksmanship skills among Latino communities that had been underserved by traditional shooting sports organizations. Elena's decision to create something new rather than reform something broken had generated results that exceeded even her optimistic projections. The Academy had become a destination for women whose capabilities had been dismissed by institutional bias, but it had also attracted male students who recognized that Elena's teaching methods produced superior results regardless of gender. The diversity of perspectives and experiences created learning environments that challenged everyone to perform at levels they hadn't thought possible. Tommy Rodriguez had emerged as the Academy's unofficial philosopher, offering insights that connected Elena's tactical training to broader questions about human potential and institutional effectiveness. "The thing about Elena," he told graduation ceremony attendees, "is that she never tried to prove the system wrong. She just built something better and let the results speak for themselves." The observation captured something essential about Elena's approach to vindication and social change. Rather than expending energy on arguments and confrontations that rarely changed institutional cultures, Elena had invested her efforts in creating tangible alternatives that demonstrated superior approaches to developing human potential. Her impossible shot had provided the platform, but her academy provided the proof that excellence could flourish when artificial barriers were removed. As the graduation ceremony concluded and families celebrated achievements that many had been told were impossible, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from the humiliation of Fort Sterling to the satisfaction of the Precision Leadership Academy. The impossible shot that had saved President Morrison's life would remain the most dramatic moment of her career, but the quiet transformations occurring daily at her academy represented the most meaningful legacy she could imagine. The system that had destroyed her military career continued to exist, albeit with reforms designed to prevent the worst abuses that Burke had perpetrated. Elena maintained professional relationships with federal agencies and military units that valued her expertise, but her primary focus remained on the individual women whose lives were being transformed through programs that proved competence existed in places where traditional systems refused to look. Standing on the Academy's shooting range as the sun set over the Arizona mountains, Elena understood that her choice to decline government offers and build something entirely new had been vindicated by results that spoke louder than any official recognition could provide. The women graduating from her program would go on to careers that would have been impossible without the confidence and skills they had developed at the academy, creating ripple effects that would benefit American society for decades to come. The impossible shot that had saved a president's life had lasted 2-3 seconds, but its consequences would endure for generations through the lives that Elena's academy had transformed, and the institutional changes that her courage had triggered. She had proven that true victory came not from conquering enemies, but from building something better than what had tried to destroy you, and that the most meaningful service to country came from developing human potential rather than serving. Institutional preferences. Elena Vasquez had failed sniper training, been exiled from the profession she loved, and forced to rebuild her life in the shadows of her former achievements. But her impossible shot had proven that failure was often just the beginning of a different kind of success, one measured not by rank or recognition, but by the lives transformed in the barriers, broken through the quiet persistence of someone who refused to accept artificial limitations on human potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.